For 6 months, I scrubbed his floors. I washed his dishes. I pressed his shirts. I served his meals with my eyes down and my hands steady and my heart breaking so quietly that no one in that entire pack house ever heard a single sound of it. And every single day, he walked past me like I was part of the furniture. But here is the thing about a mate bond. It doesn't care about disguises. It doesn't care about rank or status or the story you've built around yourself to survive. It doesn't care that you've dyed your hair a different color or that you've been suppressing your scent with herbs every morning for 6 months, or that you've trained yourself to keep your eyes on the floor whenever he enters a room. The bond is patient. It waits. And on the night of the blood moon, the one night in 3 years when no herb in the world can suppress what you are, it collects everything you owe it. All at once, in front of everyone. Like the video right now. Hit that subscribe button and drop in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see every city, every country, every person who stayed up too late to hear this story. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to stay with you. I promise you that. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because before I can tell you about the blood moon, I have to tell you about the girl who decided, 6 months before it, that disappearing was the only way to survive. Her name was Tessaly Wren. And the first thing you needed to know about Tessaly was that she had been invisible her entire life. Not by accident, but by design. Not her design. Her mother's. Her mother, Mirhen Wren, had been what the pack called an unranked omega, a wolf with a shift, a scent, a bond capacity, but no standing in the social order of the Greyveil Pack. No territory. No seat at the rank table. No protection beyond what she could negotiate for herself with her labor and her silence and her willingness to make herself small in every room she entered. Mirhen had been small for so long that smallness had become her primary skill. She had passed it on to Tessaly the way other mothers passed on recipes or jewelry. Carefully, deliberately, as a survival tool. Keep your eyes down. That was the first lesson. Never draw attention. The second, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone know what you feel. The third, the one that mattered most. Tessaly had grown up in the lower quarters of the Greyveil Pack compound, a cluster of small rooms at the eastern wing, separated from the main house by a long corridor that everyone called the Grey Hall, which was accurate in both color and atmosphere. The lower quarters were where the unranked wolves lived, the ones who worked the compound, the kitchen staff, the groundskeepers, the house workers, and their families. It was not a cruel life. She wanted to be honest about that. The Greyveil Pack was not brutal to its lower-ranked members. There was food and warmth and a roof and a system of compensation that, while modest, was consistent. She had gone to school. She had learned to read and write and calculate. She had grown up knowing her history, her heritage, her nature. She had shifted for the first time at 16, alone in the forest behind the compound, and it had been the most extraordinary experience of her life. A white wolf, small by pack standards, with eyes the color of dark amber that glowed faintly when her emotions ran high. She had never told anyone about the color of her eyes when she shifted. White wolves were rare. Rare wolves attracted attention. And attention, Mirhen had taught her, was dangerous. So Tessaly had learned to shift only when she was certain she was alone. She had learned to control the glow in her eyes, to damp it down, pull it back, keep it inside. She had learned, at 16, to be invisible even in her most natural state. At 22, her mother died. The death was not dramatic. Mirren's heart had been working harder than it should for years, straining under a condition the pack healer had identified but could not fully treat. She went quietly, in her sleep, in the small room at the end of the gray hall that she had lived in for 20 years. Tessaly sat beside her for a long time after. Then she folded her hands in her lap and made a decision. She was done being invisible in the place where her mother had been invisible before her. She was done with the gray hall and the eyes-down rule and the careful art of smallness. Not because she was angry, though she was, a deep and quiet anger that she'd been managing for years like a banked fire. But because she had looked at her mother's life and understood, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes brings, that invisibility was not the same as safety. Her mother had made herself small for 30 years, and it hadn't saved her from anything. Not from the loneliness or the exhaustion or the small, daily indignities of being perpetually overlooked. It had just made the overlooking quieter. Tessaly was going to do something different. She just didn't know yet that doing something different would lead her, 6 months later, to scrubbing the floors of Aldric Greyveil's private quarters. The Greyveil Pack's alpha was 29 years old. His name was Aldric Greyveil, which was both his given name and his rank title, because in the Greyveil lineage the alpha's name and the pack's name were the same. It was an old tradition. It meant the pack and the man were not separate things. Tessaly had seen him from a distance her entire life, and up close exactly never. This was not unusual. The distance between the alpha's quarters, the north wing, the high-ceilinged rooms with the long windows and the view of the mountain, and the eastern corridor where she had grown up was not merely physical. It was structural. It was built into the architecture of how the pack operated. The alpha moved in spaces that the lower-ranked did not enter, attended meetings that the lower-ranked were not invited to, made decisions that trickled down through layers of ranked wolves before they ever reached the people they most affected. From a distance, what Tessaly knew about Aldric Greyveil was this. He was fair by the standards of his position. He did not abuse his authority. He was not cruel to the lower-ranked members of the pack, though neither did he particularly engage with them. He was, according to every account she had ever heard, completely committed to the pack, its security, its prosperity, its future. He worked long hours. He trained hard. He had taken on the alpha role at 24 when his father died suddenly, and he had, by most measures, done well with it. He had never taken a mate. This was the thing that everyone talked about, in the way pack communities always talked about things, in fragments and illusions and conversations that went quiet when the subject of discussion walked into the room. He was 29. In wolf culture, an alpha without a mate was a structural vulnerability, because the mate bond stabilized the alpha's power at a biological level. Without it, there was a subtle but accumulating instability, like a building without its cornerstone. Functional, but stressed. The pack knew this. Aldric knew this. And for reasons no one had been able to fully explain, the bond had simply not arrived. He had met she-wolves from allied packs. He had attended the union gatherings that pack tradition marked for exactly this purpose. He had, by his own apparent admission to his second, feral cage, been completely open to it. The bond had not come. Tessaly, in the Grey Hall, had heard all of this with the half-attention of someone listening to news about a country she'd never visited. Because she was planning something that had nothing to do with Alpha Aldric Greyveil. She was planning to leave. Not to abandon the pack. She was wolf enough that the thought of a permanent severing made something in her chest seize painfully. But to leave the compound. To find a rank certification through one of the regional programs that allowed lower-ranked wolves to train and test for a skill designation. She had been sending letters for 3 months, quietly, carefully. She had one promising response from a northern training center, a 6-month program for pack administrative work, something she was genuinely good at. Numbers, organization, the management of complex schedules and records. She had the letter in her pocket, already half decided, when the notice went up on the Grey Hall board. House staff positions available, North Wing, Alpha Quarters, immediate start, 6-month minimum contract, enhanced compensation, discreet applicants only. She stood in front of the notice for a long time. Then she took out her letter from the Northern Training Center, put it back in her pocket, and went to speak to the house manager. Not because she wanted to serve. Not because she had abandoned her plans. Because the North Wing was where the pack records were kept. 60 years of records. Decisions, disputes, birth records, bloodline registrations, rank certifications, land agreements, tribunal transcripts, the complete administrative history of the Greyveil Pack. And somewhere in those records, she was almost certain of it, was the answer to a question she had been carrying for years. The question of who her father was. Her mother had never told her. Not out of cruelty. Mirhen had not had a cruel bone in her body, but out of fear. She had said only that he was someone Tessaly could not know about yet. That when the time was right, she would understand. That the knowing, if it came too early, would change things in ways that couldn't be undone. She had died before the time came. And the only thread Tessaly had, a partial name, a pack seal on an old piece of paper she'd found in her mother's things, a symbol she'd spent 2 years trying to identify, pointed to the North Wing records. So she took the job. She dyed her hair from its natural dark amber to a flat, dull brown. She bought scent suppression herbs from the town market and began taking them every morning. She dressed plainly. She kept her eyes down. She became, as her mother had always been, invisible. And on her first day in the North Wing, carrying a stack of fresh linens down the long corridor toward the Alpha's private quarters, she turned a corner and walked directly into Aldric Greyveil. The collision was minor. He was larger than she'd realized. Everyone looked smaller from a distance, and he caught the linens before they fell, instinctively, his hands closing around the stack with quick, automatic ease. Their fingers made contact for less than a second through the fabric. And something happened. Something she had no word for. A current. Not painful. Not even dramatic. Just sudden. Like a light turning on in a room you'd been navigating in the dark. Like a frequency she hadn't known existed suddenly registering. She felt it move through her from her fingertips to the base of her spine. She looked up, which she should not have done, eyes down, first rule, and found him already looking at her. His eyes were dark gray, almost charcoal. They were direct and still and carrying an expression she couldn't read, except that it was not indifference. Then he blinked, and it was gone. He handed the linens back. "Watch the corner," was all he said, and walked on. Tessaly stood in the corridor for 3 more seconds than she should have. Then she walked to the linen cupboard, put the stack away, and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. What had that been? She did not think about the answer she already knew. She refused it. She pressed it down the same way she pressed down the glow in her eyes, and the particular frequency of her scent, and all the other things she had spent her life making invisible. Later. She could think about it later. Right now, she had records to find. The North Wing records room was on the 2nd floor, adjacent to the Pack administrative office. It was not locked. It was a records room, not a vault, and the documents inside were Pack history rather than active intelligence. But it was not a room that lower-ranked staff had easy access to, and Tessaly spent her first 2 weeks quietly establishing the kind of reliable, unnoticed presence that allowed her to be in the North Wing without anyone finding it remarkable. She cleaned. She organized. She was excellent at it, efficient and thorough and quiet in the way that made supervisors relax and stop watching you closely. The head of house, a brisk woman named Dunvara, told her at the end of the first week that she was the best new addition to the house staff in years. On the 16th day, she got into the records room. She had 40 minutes before anyone would notice her absence. She found what she was looking for in 35. The file was thin, almost nothing. A record of a private meeting, sealed under Alpha authorization, 23 years ago. A notation of a union agreement, not a formal mate bond, but a recorded private union between a ranked wolf and a lower-ranked female, with specific provisions for confidentiality. And a name. Her mother's name. And beside it, in the column where the other party's name should have been, a rank title. Not a name. A title. Former Alpha consort, Greyveil line. Tessaly's hand went still on the page. She read it again. Then she read the notation below, a single line, clearly added later in different ink. Child registered under maternal name. Bloodline status. Withheld pending Alpha designation review. File sealed. Aldric Greyveil Sr., Alpha. She put the file down. She stood in the records room for a long moment, with the dust motes drifting in the afternoon light, and understood something that changed the shape of everything. Her father had been the Alpha consort of the Greyveil line, which meant her father had been the mate of the previous Alpha, which meant she was blood-related, not to Aldric, but to his family's lineage through his father's generation. Not by blood descent, but by the pack lineage structure that the Greyveil line maintained through mate bonds rather than blood alone. And the bloodline status notation, withheld pending Alpha designation review, meant that whoever had made this file had known, or suspected, that Tessaly's wolf nature was not standard, that there was something about her rank potential that required review at the Alpha level before it could be formally registered. A review that had never happened because the Alpha who'd sealed the file had died before he could conduct it. And Aldric Jr., the current Alpha, the man whose linen she'd been carrying 20 minutes ago, had never known the file existed. She left the records room exactly as she'd found it, walked calmly back to the linen cupboard, and spent the remainder of her shift with the careful, mechanical efficiency of someone operating on a different level than their surface function while their inner world rearranged itself completely. She stayed. She should have left. She knew that. The plan had been to find the information and reassess. The plan had not been to continue serving in the house of the man who was, by an indirect but legally significant lineage connection, the only person with the authority to review her sealed file. But she stayed because she realized, in the cold clarity of the following morning, that leaving now would mean she'd never get an answer that was hers to have. The seal could only be lifted by the current Alpha. She couldn't petition him directly. She was a lower-ranked house servant with no formal standing to request an audience about sealed bloodline records. She would need either rank standing of her own or someone with access who already trusted her. 6 months, she told herself. 6 months to establish enough presence, enough reliability, enough quiet trust, that when the time came, she'd have a path forward. 6 months. And so the days built on each other, one by one, like stones being laid in a careful line. She learned the rhythms of the North Wing. She learned which staff members were worth trusting and which were political, how information moved through the house, where decisions were made and by whom. She learned that Feral Cage, the Alpha's second, was more devoted to Aldric than anyone who wasn't watching closely would realize, and that this devotion was not political but personal. She learned that the pack's senior healer, a quiet man named Oswald, visited the North Wing every Tuesday and kept his own counsel about what he observed. She learned that the woman who managed the Alpha's schedule, a ranked wolf named Breathe, was methodical to the point of rigidity and deeply resentful of anyone who disrupted the order she maintained. She learned Aldric's rhythms too, not intentionally, at least not at first. It was simply impossible to work in someone's home, because the North Wing was his home, the private part of it, without learning them. Their hours, their patterns, the particular sounds of their movement. The way he took his coffee, black and strong. The way he ran early, before anyone else in the compound was awake, returning with mud on his boots and his shirt damp, and his expression, before it resettled into the Alpha's composed surface, briefly, exhausted. The way he sometimes sat at the long table in his office long after the candles burned low, not working, just sitting, thinking something he kept to himself. She tried not to notice these things. She noticed everything. And the bond, the thing she had felt in that first collision, the thing she had pressed down and refused to name, kept building despite the herbs, despite the careful management of her scent, despite the eyes-down rule she enforced on herself with increasing effort. It didn't pull loudly. It didn't demand. It did exactly what she had suspected it would do when she'd held the idea of it at arm's length in that corridor. It was patient. It waited. The first crack appeared at 3 months. She was setting the table for a formal dinner, A meeting between Aldric and the senior members of two neighboring packs. A diplomatic event that Breed had been managing with meticulous stress for 2 weeks. Tessaly had been assigned to the dining room specifically because Dunvara trusted her to be invisible in the way that formal events required. Present but imperceptible. She was placing the last setting when someone behind her spoke her name. Not her name. What she'd given as her name. Tessaly was real, but she'd given her surname as Holt instead of Wren, a minor deception that she'd told herself was for simplicity and recognized was not. Tessaly Holt. It was Feral Cage. He was leaning in the doorway, watching her with the particular quality of attention that she recognized. Now, as the mark of the Alpha's inner circle, that full presence attentiveness, the kind that registered everything. Yes. She kept her voice even. The Alpha wants the Aldenmore file on the table before the guests arrive. I'll let Breathe know. Bride's already occupied. He asked for you specifically. A pause. A very deliberate one. He says you're reliable. She had spoken to Aldric exactly 4 times in 3 months, and each exchange had been brief and functional. She had, she thought, been doing a flawless job of being unremarkable. Of being the good, quiet, invisible house worker that the North Wing required. And yet, apparently, she had been reliable enough to be remembered. She retrieved the file from the administrative office. She brought it to the dining room. She placed it at the head of the table and was turning to leave when she almost ran into him again. He was better at the corner warning than she was. He stopped 2 feet from her, the Aldenmore file already registering in his peripheral vision, his eyes landing on it, and then, briefly, very briefly, landing on her. Thank you, he said. Just that. 2 words. Completely unremarkable. She nodded, kept her eyes at his collar rather than his face, and stepped around him. Behind her, she heard him pause. Not move, just pause. That fractional stillness that she'd been trying so hard not to study. Then he walked to the table, and she walked to the door, and she spent the rest of the formal dinner in the kitchen not thinking about the way he'd paused. At 4 months, something changed in the house. It was subtle, the kind of change you registered before you understood it. A shift in the atmosphere of the compound, a tension running through the ranked wolves like a current through water. Conversations that stopped when the wrong people walked into rooms. Bride's already rigid schedule becoming something close to frantic. Farrell's usually composed expression carrying a new weight in the lines around his eyes. Tessaly noticed and said nothing and listened very carefully. What she pieced together, over the course of 2 weeks of careful listening, was this. There was a delegation coming. Not diplomatic, formal. An elder delegation from the regional elder seat, which held the collective authority over multiple packs. They were coming specifically because of the Alpha's unmated status. In wolf law, an Alpha who had not bonded by age 30 was subject to a formal review of their right to hold sovereignty. It was called a fitness assessment, an ugly name for an ugly process. It didn't mean the elder seat could simply remove an Alpha, but it meant they could impose conditions, set a timeline, force the issue through formal channels in ways that would put enormous pressure on both the Alpha and the pack's political standing with their neighbors. Aldric's 30th birthday was in 5 months. The delegation was arriving in 4 weeks. Tessaly lay awake on the night. She understood this and felt the bond do something it hadn't done before. It didn't speak, exactly. It didn't have language. But it sensed something in the direction of her chest that felt very much like urgency. Tell him. She pressed her face into her pillow and thought, I can't. Tell him. She couldn't. Not yet. Not without the sealed file being reviewed first, because without it, she was a lower-ranked house servant with a false surname and a suppressed scent and no formal standing of any kind. She would sound delusional. She would sound like someone running a manipulation. She would be removed from the compound before she finished the sentence. She needed Oswald, the senior healer, the quiet Tuesday presence who kept his own counsel. She had been weighing this for weeks. Oswald was not pack administration, not a ranked senior wolf. not someone with a political stake in the Alpha situation. He was a healer, which meant his professional obligation was to the well-being of the pack, and specifically, in this moment, to the well-being of the Alpha. If anyone would hear her out without immediately going to Breathe or Feral or the Alpha himself, it was Oswald. She went to him on a Tuesday. She sat down across from him in the small room he kept off the medical wing, with the dried herbs hanging from the beams and the old books stacked in no particular order, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." He looked at her over his reading glasses, folded his hands on the desk. "All right," she told him. Not everything. Not the bond. Not the full weight of what she felt. Not the months of careful suppression. But she told him about the records room. About the sealed file. About her mother and the name and the rank notation that had never been formally reviewed. She told him about her scent suppression and her false surname and why she'd taken the house position in the first place. When she finished, he was quiet for a very long time. "How long have you been suppressing?" he asked finally. 6 months. He made a sound. Not quite disapproval. More like a doctor confronting something that required careful management. "And your wolf? How is she handling it?" "Better than I expected," Tessaly said carefully. "Up to now." Oswald looked at her. "The blood moon is in 6 weeks." She nodded. She had been trying not to think about that. The blood moon. It came every 3 years, a convergence of specific lunar and seasonal conditions that were to wolves what a fault line was to the earth. It didn't create bonds. It didn't manufacture feelings. But it stripped away every suppression, every chemical dampener, every learned behavioral control that a wolf maintained in their daily life. For 48 hours, you were simply what you were. Unmediated, unmanaged, entirely and unavoidably yourself. No herb in the world worked during the blood moon. Oswald took his glasses off and set them on the desk. "Tessaly, I need to ask you something directly, and I need a direct answer." He paused. "Is there a bond?" She looked at her hands. "Yes," she said quietly. Oswald sat back. "How long have you known?" "Since my first day. The first time she stopped. "The first corridor. The linens." "He felt it too," Oswald said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what he felt." "I do," the healer said quietly. "I've been watching him for 4 months, trying to understand why his restlessness has shifted quality. Why the exhaustion has changed character." He looked at the window. "He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know the source. But he has been feeling something since the beginning of this year that he cannot name, and it has been making everything harder." Tessaly felt something lurch in her chest. "The suppression," Oswald said carefully, "doesn't eliminate the bond. You know that. It just prevents him from identifying the source. From his perspective, he is experiencing the pull of an unresolved bond with no traceable direction. That is not a small thing to live with, Tessaly. For a wolf who is already under pressure about the fitness assessment. For a man who has been trying to understand why the bond hasn't arrived when, in fact, he stopped. In fact, it arrived 6 months ago," she finished. "And I've been standing in his kitchen every morning pretending to be someone I'm not." The silence was not comfortable. "I need to see the file," Oswald said. "I need to formally review it as the pack senior healer before we go any further. That's the only legitimate path." He paused. "And Tessaly, we have 6 weeks before the blood moon, which means we have 6 weeks to do this properly. If we don't, the blood moon does it for us," she said. "In front of everyone." "Yes." She breathed. "Then let's do it properly," she said. Oswald filed a formal healer's petition with the pack administrative body to review a sealed bloodline record from the previous Alpha's tenure. It was within his rights to do so. Health and bloodline records fell under healer jurisdiction in Greyveil Pack law, and a sealed file from 23 years ago had no ongoing security classification. The file was retrieved and brought to Oswald's office within the week. He spent 2 days with it. He cross-referenced it with birth records, with bloodline registries, with with the medical history entries her mother had accumulated over 20 years as a lower-ranked pack member. He consulted 2 historical texts that he wouldn't let Tessaly see while he was reading them. On the 3rd day, he called her back into his office. He sat across from her with the kind of stillness that meant what he was about to say was large enough to require anchoring before it was released into the air. "Your father," he began carefully, "was a wolf named Perrin. He was the formally bonded mate of Alpha Greyveil Sr., not a secondary arrangement. A fully recognized mate bond." He paused. "In Greyveil lineage law, the mate of the Alpha is not the Alpha's property or subordinate. They hold the second seat sovereignty, which means that when an Alpha's mate has a child from a prior union, a child born before the mate bond was formalized, that child carries a lineage classification." Tessaly's hands were very still in her lap. "What classification?" she asked. Oswald looked at her steadily. "Sovereign adjacent lineage, which, in practical terms, means the pack's standard rank hierarchy does not apply to you in the way it applied to your mother. Your father's bond position elevated your registration status. It should have been formally recorded and reviewed when you were born." A long pause. "The notation in the file, withheld pending Alpha designation review, was meant to protect you. The previous Alpha sealed the file because your elevated status, if publicly known in the wrong political climate, would have put you at risk. He intended to review and formalize it when the timing was safer." His voice was quiet. "He died before he could." Tessaly did not speak for a very long time. "What does sovereign adjacent mean?" she asked at last. "In real terms. For me. Right now. It means," Oswald said carefully, "that when a bond exists between you and the current Alpha, it cannot be classified as a cross-rank bond. It cannot be dismissed on grounds of status disparity. It is, by the lineage law that the Greyveil Pack has maintained for 6 generations, a recognized eligible bond." He paused once more. "You are not a lower-ranked house servant who bonded with her Alpha, Tessaly. You are the unregistered sovereign-adjacent daughter of the previous Alpha's mate, who has been living unrecognized in the lower quarters her entire life." She stared at him. "I am going to need a moment," she said very quietly. Oswald nodded. "Take as many as you need." She took 3 days. 3 days to sit with it, to hold it from different angles, to feel angry, because she was angry, a burning, clarifying anger at 22 years of eyes down and smallness and the gray hall and her mother's careful, fearful silence. At a system that had let a child grow up unregistered and unprotected because a man had died with a sealed file in the administrative record and no one had looked for it. And then, when the anger had burned through its first layer and reached the quieter thing underneath it, 3 days to think about him. Aldric, who had been feeling the pull of an unresolved bond for 6 months without knowing where it came from. Who sat alone at his table with the candles burning low, thinking something he kept entirely to himself. Who had said watch the corner in a long corridor the first morning and thank you 4 months later with a 2-second pause afterward that she had been trying not to analyze ever since. Who was 3 months away from an elder seat assessment that was going to put his right to hold sovereignty under formal scrutiny, not knowing that the answer to his unmated status had been standing in his kitchen every morning. She went back to Oswald on the 4th day. "We need to tell him," she said, "before the delegation arrives. Before anyone else. He needs to know." Oswald nodded slowly. "I agree. But Tessaly, the way this is done matters. If we do it incorrectly, the faction within the pack that has been quietly pushing the fitness assessment agenda will use it. They'll frame it as a manipulation, as an attempt by an unranked individual to claim status through a convenient bond narrative. Then how do we do it correctly? We bring the file to him directly, in the presence of Feral Cage as witness, through the formal healer's petition channel. It goes on record before anything else. The bloodline review, the lineage classification, the formal registration of your status, all of it, documented and witnessed, before the bond is discussed at all." He looked at her carefully. and then we let him make his own decisions. She nodded. And if he, she stopped. If he what? She looked at her hands. If the bond is real and the status is real, and he still doesn't, if he still chooses not to, then that is his right, Oswald said gently. A recognized eligible bond is not an obligation. It is an open door. He chooses whether to walk through it. She breathed. Okay. Are you prepared for that possibility? Was she? She had spent 6 months suppressing the bond. 6 months of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. She had convinced herself that she was keeping her feelings at arm's length, maintaining objectivity, protecting herself. But sitting in Oswald's office with the truth finally out in the open, she understood what she had actually been doing. She had been falling. Slowly, carefully, with all the restraint she possessed, she had been falling in love with the man whose floors she scrubbed. Not because of the bond. The bond was there, deep and constant as a river underground. But love was something built on top of it, constructed from moments. From the mud on his boots before the day put its demands on him. From the way he treated the house staff, never harshly, never with contempt, with a kind of functional respect that suggested he didn't notice rank the way everyone assumed he did. From the Tuesday nights, she'd overheard him telling Farrell that they needed to find a way to improve the compensation structure for the lower quarters, that it wasn't right, that it hadn't been right for years. From the fact that he was alone, and tired, and doing a job that was too large for one person, and doing it without complaint, and sitting at his table in the late hours with his hands folded, and his face carrying something that looked very much like grief for a life he couldn't quite reach. She had fallen, which meant that yes, she was prepared for the possibility that he might not choose the open door. Prepared didn't mean it wouldn't hurt. Let's get it on record, she said. All of it. Oswald filed the formal petition on a Wednesday. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, 5 weeks before the blood moon, for weeks before the elder delegation's arrival. Monday came. She stood outside the Alpha's formal meeting room in the north wing. In a plain gray dress she'd pressed herself that morning, with her dyed brown hair pulled back and her hands perfectly still at her sides. Oswald stood beside her. Through the closed door, she could hear the quiet murmur of Farrell and Aldric in conversation, the sound stopping when someone knocked. The door opened. She walked in. Aldric was standing at the far side of the table, not seated, which she hadn't expected. He was in the meeting room version of his usual clothes, composed and contained, his dark gray eyes moving from Oswald to the file Oswald carried to Tessaly in a single, assessing pass. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. She looked back, directly, for the first time in 6 months. No eyes down. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, but real. Farrell closed the door. Oswald walked them through the file methodically, thoroughly, and without embellishment. He laid out the documentation, the lineage law, the registration notation, the previous Alpha seal, and the reason for it, the formal conclusion of his review. He was clear and careful and complete. The room was very quiet when he finished. Aldric hadn't spoken during the entire presentation. He stood at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the file, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. It was complex, processing, something moving through it in layers. Then he looked at her. "Your name is Tessaly Wren," he said, not accusing, stating, "Yes." Not whole. "No. I'm sorry." A pause. "How long have you been in the compound?" 6 months. "And the scent suppression?" Her breath caught slightly. "Since the first day?" His jaw tightened. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because I didn't know how to have this conversation. And I needed to find the file before I could have it honestly." A pause. "I came here for information about my father, not for—" She stopped. Started again. "The rest of it wasn't something I planned." "The rest of it," he repeated quietly. The room was very still. Farrell, beside the door, was watching with an expression she couldn't read. Oswald had folded his hands on the file and was looking at the table. Aldric pushed off the table, and walked around it slowly. Not toward her. He stopped at the side, by the window, looking out at the mountain for a moment. "I have been," he said carefully, with his back partially to her, "experiencing something for 6 months that I could not identify. That I asked Oswald about twice and could not get an adequate explanation for. That has been affecting my sleep and my focus," and he stopped, turned back to face her. "Do you understand what it feels like to sense a bond and be unable to locate its source? To have your wolf pulling in a direction that has no visible target?" She did understand. She understood exactly. Because she had been the source, carefully hidden, generating the pull, and then burying it under herbs and behavior every single day. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time she meant it at a depth she hadn't managed in the first apology. He looked at her for a long time. Oswald. He didn't look away from her. "The bloodline registration, how long to formalize it?" "I can file the formal designation today," Oswald said carefully. "It would be on record by end of week." "Do it." Still looking at Tessaly. "And the elder delegation arrives in 4 weeks. The formal bloodline registration will be part of the documented record before they arrive, which resolves the cross-rank concern." "Aldric." Farrell's voice, quiet from the door. "Perhaps we should. Leave us, please." Firm. Not cruel. Absolute. A pause. Then the quiet sound of the door opening and closing. Tessaly and Aldric stood on opposite sides of the meeting room. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to be honest. Whatever the answer is." She nodded. "The suppression. The false name. The 6 months." His eyes were steady on hers, dark gray and direct, and carrying the same thing she'd seen in that first corridor. That look that was not indifference. Was any of this about the bond? About finding a way to make the bond legitimate before anyone knew it existed? It was the hard question. The one she'd asked herself in various forms for weeks. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in this room. "I came here for the file. I came here for my father's name and the truth about what I am." That was real. A pause. The bond was already there. Before I understood any of this. I wasn't managing it strategically, I was managing it because I didn't know what else to do with it. Because I had no standing. Because I knew that if I said anything before I could say it legitimately, it would look exactly like what you're asking me if it was. He was quiet for a moment. "Did it work?" he asked then, and his voice had shifted just slightly. "The suppression. Is that? Do you feel it even through the herbs? Or does it muffle it completely?" Something about the question, the particular direction of it, made her breath change quality. "It muffles the signal," she said carefully. "It doesn't change what's there. For me," he said slowly, "it's been constant. Even without knowing the source. Even not knowing it was you." He paused. 6 months of constant. She couldn't quite speak. "The herbs stopped working during the blood moon," he said. Not a question. "Yes." 5 weeks. "Yes." He looked at her, really looked at her, the full, unguarded version, the one without the alpha's composed surface. He looked at her like someone who had been trying to solve an equation for a very long time and had just received the one variable that made all the others make sense. "I'm going to need time to think," he said finally. "I need to process this. All of this. Not because he stopped, gathered himself. "It's a lot, Tessaly." "I know," she said. "Take whatever time you need." She walked to the door. "Tessaly." She stopped, hand on the door frame. "You don't have to keep your eyes down," he said quietly. "Not in this house. Not anymore." She didn't turn around. But she felt something unknot in her chest that had been knotted so long she'd forgotten what it felt like without it. She nodded and walked out. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of her life. The bloodline registration was filed and recorded. Oswald submitted it through the formal channels with meticulous documentation, and by the end of the week, Tessaly Wren's status was in the pack record as sovereign adjacent lineage, no longer a lower-ranked house servant, no longer Tessaly Holt, no longer invisible by necessity. The house staff found out, as house staffs always find out, about 2 days after the formal filing. The response was mixed. Dunvara, the head of house, the brisk and practical woman who had called Tessaly the best new addition in years, took it with a pragmatic nod and said that it explained the quality of her inventory management, which was a deeply Dunvara thing to say and which Tessaly found, unexpectedly, very comforting. Several of the ranked wolves who came through the North Wing on business looked at her differently, some with curiosity, a few with calculation, one or two with a hostility that she noted and filed away. Aldric did not come to her. She did not go to him. But something changed in the North Wing corridors. A change in the quality of the air when they were both present, which happened more frequently than before, as if something was slowly, naturally reducing the distance between them despite neither of them actively engineering it. He looked at her now, not the brief, functional glances of their months-long studied near misses. Properly, with that direct, still attention that was his baseline way of engaging with things he was taking seriously. She felt it from across rooms, when his back wasn't turned, when the composure of the alpha's surface gave way for just a moment to the man underneath. On the Tuesday of the second week, she was in the long corridor when she heard him stop at the corner. The same corner, the one where they had first collided. She turned. He was standing 10 feet away, holding something. A file, half-read. He was looking at her. "I went to the records room," he said without preamble. She waited. "I read the file." He paused. "All of it, including the notation my father made." Another pause. "I'm angry on your behalf. That this was sealed and forgotten. That you grew up not knowing." A breath. "That your mother spent 20 years in the lower quarters when she didn't have to be there." She felt the sting of it, quick and sharp. "She chose it," Tessaly said carefully. "She was afraid. She thought invisible was safer. She was wrong. I know. So were you." She met his eyes. "I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment, with the file in his hand and the afternoon light coming through the far window and the compound quiet around them. "I'm not going to rush this," he said. "I want you to know that. It's not," he stopped. Chose different words. "I'm not going to come to you with the bond as the argument. I'm not going to say the bond exists, therefore this is what happens. That's not how I want this to go." "What do you want?" she asked quietly. It surprised her, the directness of the question, the way she'd stopped reaching for indirection. He looked slightly caught by it. Then, after a pause, "I want to know you. The actual you. Not the house servant I've been glimpsing for 6 months. Not the file in the records room. The person." She felt the bond stir beneath her ribcage, warm and certain and very, very patient. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed, and walked on. 3 weeks is not a long time. But when a bond has been building for 6 months in secret, the 3 weeks after it becomes known feel like a different kind of time. Denser. Fuller. Like each day contains more weight than it should. They talked. Formally at first, in the meeting room, with Farrell present for the first session, discussing the practical implications of the bloodline registration for the elder delegation. But formality, in the presence of a bond that had been waiting patiently for 6 months, has a limited lifespan. By the second week, it was just the two of them, at the long table in his office, with tea neither of them was really drinking, talking about things that had nothing to do with pack administration. She told him about her mother, about the Grey Hall and the eyes-down rule and the careful lessons about smallness that had felt like love, because they were love, even when they were also limitation. He listened without trying to fix it. She told him about the shift at 16, alone in the forest, the white wolf and the amber eyes. He went very still when she described it. And then he said, quietly, that white was extremely rare, and that the pack's historical records contained exactly 3 documented cases in the last 2 centuries, and that 2 of them were in the sovereign lineage. She stared at him. "The third," she managed. "Unregistered," he said, looking at her. "Female. Lower quarters. 23 years ago. Her mother, Tessaly Wren, who had spent 20 years making herself invisible, had been a white wolf." She sat with that for a very long time. He let her. That was the thing about him that she kept coming back to, the quality of his waiting, the patience of his presence. He did not fill silences reflexively. He did not rush. He held space with the same deliberate quality that he held everything. And in that space, she kept finding things she hadn't expected to find. He was funny, quietly, dry, careful wit that emerged sideways and caught her off guard. He was genuinely curious about her opinions, about how things looked from perspectives different from his own, about the particular texture of life in the gray hall that he had never experienced, and clearly thought about more than his position allowed him to address directly. He was, she discovered, exactly as alone as he had looked from a distance. The alpha role had built a structure around him that was simultaneously protective and isolating. Everyone in his life operated in relation to his position. Even Farrell, whose devotion was real, filtered it through the lens of the second's role. There was no one who simply talked to him, who told him when his reasoning had gaps, who sat across from him without an agenda. She could do that. She wanted to do that. She recognized, in the third week, that she had stopped managing what she felt. Not performing honesty, actually experiencing it without the management layer that had been there since the first morning in the long corridor. She was in love with him, fully. The bond and the person, woven together until she couldn't separate them and had stopped trying to. What she didn't know was what he felt. She knew the bond was there for him. She knew the 6 months of constant pull had resolved into a source. But love was not the same as recognition. Feeling the bond was not the same as choosing what to do with it. She waited, as she had become very good at doing. The blood moon arrived on a Thursday. It came the way it always came. Not suddenly, but with a building quality in the air over the preceding 2 days, a particular charge that every wolf in the compound felt regardless of what they were doing. A sharpening, a heightening. Tessaly woke on the morning of the blood moon and lay in her bed. Not the lower quarters anymore. Dunvara had moved her to a room in the east guest wing when the registration formalized, a room with a window that didn't need plastic sheeting, and knew immediately that the herbs were already failing. It wasn't painful. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply like a fog lifting. Everything she had been muffling came back, full strength, in the first hour of the morning, including the bond. It was like someone had turned a volume dial from 2 to 10 in a single motion. She felt it everywhere. The direction of it, his precise location in the north wing, 3 corridors and a staircase away, was as clear as a lit window in a dark field. She dressed carefully. She went about the morning with deliberate calm. At mid-morning, a knock on her door. "Farrell, he wants to see you," Farrell said, and his voice carried something she recognized, now, as something close to relief. "Now, if you're able." She was able. She crossed the north wing. She knocked on his office door. "Come in." He was standing at the long window, his back to her. He turned when she entered. He looked at her, and she watched the moment when the blood moon's amplification hit his senses and the precision of the source. Her, standing in the doorway, no suppression, no management, just herself, registered fully. His eyes changed. Not dramatically, but they changed. "Tessaly, I know," she said quietly. "I can feel it too." He crossed the room. He didn't rush. He moved the way he always moved, deliberate and unhurried. But there was something different in it today, a direction that had been chosen and was being followed without hesitation. He stopped in front of her, close, the closest they had been since the first morning. "I have been thinking," he said, "for 3 weeks, very carefully, about what I want to say to you." She waited. "I have been trying to be fair, to separate the bond from what I feel outside of it, to make sure that he paused, to make sure my feelings aren't simply the bond pulling and me following." "And?" she asked softly. "And," he said, "I can't separate them. Not because I can't think clearly, but because they're the same thing. What I feel for you when I'm sitting at that table and you're telling me about your mother, Or when you push back on my reasoning about the Eastern Territories without any awareness that most of my senior council doesn't do that. Or when you look at me without the eyes down thing and I can actually see your face. He stopped. That's not the bond doing something to me. That's just what happened. While the bond was waiting, she felt her chest expand with something that had been folded for a very long time. The bond opened a door, she said softly. It was familiar language, Sorka's phrasing, that she'd turned over in her mind more than once. What you feel walking through it is yours. He looked at her. Where did you hear that? I think I've been thinking it for a while. He reached up slowly and touched her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, careful and deliberate. She felt the bond surge, warm and deep, and this time she let it. She stopped managing it. She let it be exactly what it was. I want to do this properly, he said. The formal recognition, the elder delegation, all of it on record and visible and honest. A pause. But I want you to know, before any of that, before it becomes a political event or a pack announcement or anything other than just this, I want you to know that I'm choosing this. Not because the bond arrived, not because you're sovereign adjacent and the elder delegation is coming, because you are who you are, and 3 weeks was enough time to understand that, and I don't want to wait any longer to say it. She looked at him, this complicated, careful, profoundly alone man who had been sitting at his table in the late hours for 5 years without anyone to simply sit with him, and felt the decision finalize in her like a key turning in a lock. Then don't wait, she said. He didn't. The elder delegation arrived in the 4th week to a compound that had shifted on its axis. Tessaly stood in the formal receiving hall, not in the kitchen, not in the corridor, not with her eyes down. At Aldric's side, the formal recognition documented and witnessed, and on record. Oswald had ensured that the bloodline registration, the lineage classification, and the formal mate bond acknowledgement were all part of the documentation the elder seat received before the delegation's first meeting. The faction that had been quietly building the fitness assessment pressure found itself with no ground to stand on. The fitness assessment proceeded anyway. It was a formal process, and formal processes have their own momentum, but it resolved, within 2 days, in the way that formal processes resolve when the answer is right in front of them. The alpha of the Greyveil Pack had bonded. The bond was recognized, documented, and legitimate under every layer of pack law that applied. There was nothing to assess. The head of the elder delegation, an old woman named Pethera, with the kind of deliberate stillness that suggested she had seen many things and been surprised by very few of them, shook Tessaly's hand at the end of the formal proceedings and said, "The seal your father's alpha placed on your file was meant to protect you." In the end, I think it did. Tessaly thought about 22 years in the Grey Hall, about her mother's careful lessons in smallness. In the end, she agreed. She shifted that night for the first time in years. Not alone this time. At the edge of the forest at the back of the compound, in the dark, with the blood moon's final night burning white overhead. He shifted beside her. His wolf was dark, almost black, enormous, with the particular quality of the alpha's form, absolute and contained, and somehow fundamentally itself rather than threatening. He moved through the forest the way he moved through rooms, like the space had been made for him, and he had always known it. Her wolf was white. She stood in the undergrowth and felt herself, fully, completely, without management or suppression or the careful art of invisibility, and it was the most extraordinary experience she'd had since the first time. Better, even, because this time she wasn't alone in the forest. This time the forest knew who she was. He circled her once, slowly. The bond, at full strength and full acknowledgement, moved between them like a river finding its channel. They ran. Into the hollow dark, into the old trees, into the world that had been waiting on the other side of a door that fear had kept closed for 22 years. And it was, she thought, exactly what freedom felt like. Things changed after the blood moon, and things also stayed the same, and that balance was its own kind of grace. The Grey Hall was renovated that spring, a project that Aldric had apparently been planning for over a year and pushed forward the moment the political pressure of the elder delegation resolved. Better rooms, better compensation, a formal recognition that the lower-ranked staff of the compound were not peripheral to the pack's functioning, but central to it. Tessaly's rooms moved to the north wing permanently. She took on the administrative role that her skills had always been suited for, not as a servant, but as a partner in the management of the compound's complex operations, working alongside Farrell and Breathe and bringing the particular precision she'd developed years before anyone knew her name. Farrell warmed to her slowly, the way serious men warm to things that are going to be permanent, reluctantly, and then completely. Breathe remained Breathe, which was its own form of acceptance. Oswald, at the next Healers' Assembly, presented a paper on dormant bloodline registration and the systematic failures that led to gifted wolves growing up unclassified. It was not a comfortable paper. It was a necessary one. Tessaly wrote to 3 women she'd found in the records room during her research, unregistered wolves, daughters and granddaughters of sealed files, living below the thresholds they were entitled to, and had Oswald's team follow up on each of them. She did not ask permission for this. Aldric, when he found out, looked at her with that expression she'd cataloged from a distance for so long, the one she now recognized as what happens when something surprises and satisfies him simultaneously. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I didn't need to," she said. "It was the right thing to do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, yes, it was. She filed the cases through the formal administrative channels the following morning. By summer, 2 of the 3 women had begun the registration process that should have started at their births. The third, she discovered, had already left her pack for another territory years ago. She sent a letter. She didn't know if it would be received. She sent it anyway. There is a specific kind of invisibility that is taught, not chosen. Tessaly Wren had been invisible by design, her mother's design, built from fear, built from a world that made smallness feel like the only safe option. She had inherited it, refined it, and eventually carried it with such skill that she'd been able to deploy it as a tool even when it was no longer strictly necessary. And in that strange, 6-month period of proximity and concealment and deliberate, managed distance, something unexpected had happened. She had not just used the invisibility. She had learned through it. She had learned who he was before she knew he mattered. She had seen him without the frame of significance, just a man, in his home, doing his work, carrying his weight alone. She had fallen in love with the unguarded version, the one that existed before anyone knew to make it matter. And he had felt the bond without knowing its source, which meant that everything he'd built toward her, the slow movement, the careful words, the deliberate and ungrasping recognition, had come from him. Not from a name or a file or a lineage status. From her. What she wants you to take from this. Smallness is not the same as safety. Mirhan Wren had believed that, had built her life around it, had passed it to her daughter with the best love she had. But Tessaly's survival did not come from making herself small. It came from understanding, on a cold night in a gray corridor, that the thing she was hiding was not a weakness. It was not something to manage and suppress and keep below the surface so no one would notice. It was a white wolf. It was a bond that didn't care about false names or dyed hair or herbs taken every morning. It was herself. And the moment she stopped apologizing for that, not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly, in the way she walked into a room and looked at who she needed to look at, everything that had always been hers began, finally, to arrive. The bond did not save her. The love did not save her. She saved herself. The love was just the extraordinary thing that was waiting on the other side. If you felt this story, if any part of it reached into something you recognize, then you already know why we keep telling them. We tell these stories for every person who grew up being taught that the safest version of themselves was the smallest version. For every person who has been suppressing something real for so long that the suppression has started to feel like personality. You are not too much. You are not the wrong kind. You are not invisible by nature. You were taught to be. And everything that was taught can be unlearned. This channel exists to tell you that. In every story, every week, in wolves and moonlight and bonds and forests, and every shape that truth takes when it's trying to reach someone who needs it. If this story gave you something, hit subscribe. Right now, turn on the bell. Because next week, there is another one waiting. Another world. Another truth in another shape. And I want you here for it. Every single week, someone finds this channel at exactly the moment they needed to. Maybe that's you. Maybe it was always you. Subscribe. Stay. We'll be here when you come back.